Turkey wants to be a European power now, and this is really interesting. So basically, Turkey wants to get involved in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. This is very, very interesting, given the fact that Crimea used to be under the Ottoman Empire, believe it or not. It is quite amazing. And so Turkey wanting to revive its empire, does want to retake its old territory. And also, let's not forget that Turkey and Russia have a very long history of going to war again and again and again. There were many wars between the Turks and the Russians won every single one of them. So this is not really surprising at all. And the old beef is coming back from the dead. It's being revived. And as I have said many times, Turkey and Russia have a very, very long history of going to war with each other. They had numerous wars against one another. Russia won all of them. And the old beef, the old animosity is coming back from the dead. I mean, it always was there. It was lingering about in the political climate of the world. But here we go. You see the whole thing happening again. And we see the old animosity of history coming right back. And so Turkey wants to revive its old empire. And let's not forget, Russia right now controls Crimea. And the Turks used to control Crimea. So the Turks, wanting to revive their old empire, want to retake Crimea. And do you know who else lives in Crimea? It's not just Russians. It's also Tatars, ethnic Turks. And so Turkey wants to use those people as a pretext, as a reason by which to justify retaking Crimea. They want to use those Tatars as proxies against the Russians. That's what they want to do. That's why Erdogan will talk about the Tatars living in Crimea. That's the reason for that. And if you look at a map of the Ottoman Empire, you will see that Crimea was under the Ottoman Empire. So the Turks want to revive their empire. They want to retake Crimea. The ideological spectrum of Turkey it's mixed up. You have Islamo-nationalism, you have secular Turkish nationalism, about which I did a video and uploaded it today. And then you have just plain old Islamism. And in all these different parts of the ideological spectrum, and all these different factions, you have overlaps. You have, for example, an overlap between secular Turkish nationalism and Islamo-nationalism. And in both of these factions, there is aspirations for empire, aspirations to revive the Ottoman Empire. And then in Islamism, in plain old Islamism, there is this aspiration to bring back the Islamic Caliphate, to bring back the Sultanate and all that stuff. But there, in all these factions, in the entire spectrum of Turkish ideology, you have this idea of reviving empire. You are wrong about secular nationalists and base your reasons on ultra-nationalist, non-secularist Young Turks movement who defended against Christian crusade vis-a-vis Armenian and Greeks in 1900. Well, I mentioned the war between the Turks and the Greeks. Could you please tell me what I said in that video that was wrong? Be specific, please. In Turkey, you can find highly liberal society. They have huge gay clubs. Yes, and Kemal Ataturk was a homosexual, and there were sultans who were pedophiles and pederasts, and you find these degenerates in Turkish history. This is not really surprising. Let's go back to this article here. It says here, Turkey wants to be a European power now. Ankara is preparing to send peacekeeping troops in Ukraine and to deepen ties with the EU. So Turkey wants to deepen its security ties with the Germans. And where did we see this before in history? World War I. And every week or so, we are getting these articles coming out talking about how Turkey and Europe wants to deepen ties, deepen relations, and all this stuff. And it says here, for Turkey, the United States has never been a reliable friend. And we have seen this before. So we can go back to the Cold War. And during the Cold War, the CIA made sure that Turkey would be the second most armed country in NATO. And this was a part of the whole Gladio operation. Gladio was a giant major operation that was taking place in the European Union. In Europe, the European Union did not exist during the Cold War, but it was taking place in Europe, and the CIA and all these Western European intelligence agencies, they were looking for fanatics, right-wing fanatics, nationalists, to arm and train so that they could use them as proxies against the Soviet Union. This was what the whole Cold War Gladio operation was about. Gladio had a lot of different concentration points where it was very, very heavily active. So heavily active in Italy. I think Italy was the main place for Gladio operations. A lot of Italian fanatics were part of Gladio. They were being armed and trained by the CIA and also by Italian intelligence. I've talked about this many times, but the biggest Gladio operation was the Bologna massacre, where somebody ignited a bomb in the middle of a plaza, murdering a whole bunch of people. I think they murdered somewhere around 30 or 40 something people. It was dozens of people. They murdered dozens of people, and then the CIA and Italian intelligence did this terrorist attack in order to blame it on the communists, and this was all about sparking nationalist hatred. Well, Gladio was also very, very heavily involved in Turkey. They were really involved in Turkish politics, and what the CIA was interested in was igniting a hardcore Turkish nationalist movement that could be used to fight against communism. And so this was the whole goal. So there was a Turkish fanatic by the name of, his name was Alp Arslan al-Turkis. He was a Turkish Nazi. He read Mein Kampf. He was a hardcore Nazi. He believed in evolutionism, Darwinism. He was a hardcore racist. He hated Greeks. He hated Armenians. He was just a Nazi. He was a Turkish neo-Nazi. And Alp Arslan Turkis then created an organization that we now know today as the Grey Wolves. He founded the Grey Wolves. This was during the Cold War, and the Grey Wolves they're still around. They are very active, and they're all part of the Turkish deep state. They're all part of the Turkish deep state, and they talk about the importance of the Turkish race. They say that the Altai regions are the homeland or the motherland of the white race. That the Turks are the original whites. They talk about how Turkish people are superior to people who aren't Turkish. They're superior to Greeks, and they're superior to Armenians. I mean, this was the type of rhetoric that they were exclaiming during the Cold War, and they still believe in this sort of thing. And they were all being used by the CIA. So when we talk about Turkish nationalism, we have to understand that Turkish nationalism is something that has been backed by the United States. It was backed by the United States and Turkish intelligence during the Cold War. And it's a very, very real phenomenon. So when we see this influx of Turkish nationalism, or when we see this spark in Turkish nationalist demonstrations in Turkey and all that stuff, a lot of people start thinking, oh my God, this is great because they're nationalists and they're not Islamists. What people need to understand is the history of the collaboration between nationalists and Islamists in Turkey. It's been going on for a very long time. You can go all the way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. You will see it there. You can go back to the Young Turks revolution that overthrew the Sultan in, 1912? It was in the early 1910s. They overthrew the Sultan, and they wanted to establish a secular Ottoman government where there would be a harmony between Islam and secularism, or Islamists and secularists, and the Young Turks were fanatics. So people start talking about how secular nationalism is wonderful in Turkey, but if you look at the history of it, it's pretty murderous, and the Ottoman Empire was at its most murderous point when it was under a secularist. So, but my whole point is that the CIA and Turkey have had a relationship for a very long time. Gladio and Turkey, that was going on during the Cold War. And so Turkey not seeing the United States as a reliable friend. I think this was definitely witnessed when there was this whole controversy between the Biden administration and Turkey over Turkey buying S-400s, the big Russian missile defense system. It's called the S-400. And Russia bought the Russian S-400. And when the Americans saw that, they said, Turkey, you're not going to be buying any of our fighter jets. We're not going to sell you any of our fighter jets. Absolutely not. That was it. And Turkey said, you know what? We got this plan. And we've had this plan for a long time to build our own fighter jet. I mean, Turkey has been working on its own fighter jet for years. And Turkey said, okay, America, you don't want to sell us your fighter jet? We are going to accelerate our plan to make our own indigenously engineered fighter jet. And they started working on it even faster. They accelerated the process of producing this fighter jet, and bam, wham. And I believe by 2028, it is expected that this fighter jet will be ready to be used, ready for operation. So what America did when it shrugged Turkey off was it pushed Turkey to intensify its aspiration to be militarily independent. Now, I've talked about this before, and this is really the main theme of this channel, I would say. The main theme of this channel is talking about history reviving and history rhyming and getting into the nitty-gritty of certain historical facts and getting into the nitty-gritty of geopolitics, right? This is the whole theme of this channel. The whole theme of this channel is to make history come alive. That is the whole theme of this channel, is to show you that history is not just something that is limited to the books that you read, to the textbooks that you read. It's to show you that history rhymes and that history is something that is living in a sense. It's living in the sense that it's not just events that took place in the past, but rather it is events that are there to teach us about what will happen unless we learn from history. And the problem is, the biggest lesson, or really the only lesson that we get from history, is that we do not learn from history. This is the only lesson. And I believe it was Hegel who made this maxim, who made this statement. I learned it from a professor in Oklahoma. His name was J. Rufus Fears. Very good professor of Greek and Roman history. Very, very educated guy. He passed away years ago, unfortunately. You can still watch his lectures on YouTube. Loved watching his videos. And I did read one of his articles in which he made that statement about how the only thing that we learn from history is what? That we do not learn from history. And so you look at history and what do you find? The Ottoman Empire, Russo-Turkish wars, Balkan wars, German militarism. That is what you see in modern history. Revolution in France. That's what you see. Japanese militarism, Chinese-Japanese conflicts, because there was more than one war between the Japanese and the Chinese. Conflict over Taiwan, conflict between the Russians and the Koreans. Conflict between the Chinese and the Japanese over who's going to control Taiwan, who's going to control who's going to control Korea. That's what we see in history. And so what do we see today? What do we still see happening today? Tensions between the Germans and the Russians. Tension between the Turks and the Russians. Tension between the British and the Russians. We saw that there was a war in the past called the Crimean War between the British and the Russians. Was there not? And so today we see what? Tension between the British and the Russians. Tension between the Poles and the Russians. Tension between the Armenians and the Turks, which eventually culminated into a full-blown genocide. And what do we see today? Tension between the Armenians and the Turks. History is a living thing. And it's there to teach us. And the whole purpose of this YouTube channel is to teach you that history is alive. And it's to make history become alive. It's to animate history before people's eyes. That is the whole purpose of this channel. The prospect of Trump's America gifting Ukraine to Russian Vladimir Putin and wrecking NATO is as troubling for Turkey as it is for the European Union. Okay, all this stuff about, oh, we really care about the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Oh, that's just, we care about this so damn much. Oh, absolutely. All that is bullshit. Here is the bottom line. Everybody wants territory. Everybody wants to expand. Turkey wants to expand. Turkey wants to revive its empire. How do we do this? Oh, well, there's a war in Ukraine. Russia controls the Crimea. We used to control the Crimea. We used to control parts of Ukraine back in the glory days of our Ottoman Empire. So the Turks, being the LARPers of the Ottoman Empire, they want to bring back the glory days. So what does that mean? Take advantage of the fact that there are now talks between the Americans and the Russians and try to establish your agenda to expand troops into Crimea. That's what this is about, under the guise of being a peacekeeping force. But it's all being done for the purpose of what? For the purpose of reviving empire. That's what this is. It's all deception. It's all intrigue. These people don't give a shit about territorial integrity. That's all a bunch of bullshit. Hell, Turkey controls Syria right now. Whatever happened to the freedom of the Syrian people? Isn't that why they overthrew Bashar al-Assad? Because of the democracy of the democracy of the Syrian people? Isn't that what that was all about? Isn't that what all that bullshit was about? And what happened after Assad was overthrown? Turkey was there, Israel was there. What happened to the sovereignty of Syria? Well, you'll say, well, the Russians are there too. The Russians were invited. The Turks were not invited. Israel sure as hell wasn't invited. They just barged in. The Russians at least were invited. But Turkish policymakers also see the ongoing crisis as an opportunity. I already read that. Turkey has also been openly flexing its muscles in the Middle East, where the fall of the Assad regime in Syria has enhanced its influence, but it is also quietly becoming more aware of itself as a key stakeholder in European security. Translation: the Germans are reviving their military. All these Europeans are talking about making their military stronger. Turkey has been making its military stronger. Turkey is on its way to having its own fighter jet. Turkey has a very large navy. It's expanding its naval presence in the Mediterranean. It's expanding its military presence in Africa, in the South Caucasus. Oh, wow. So what does that mean? This is the opportunity. The Americans are telling the Europeans, get your militaries more powerful. Turkey says this is our opportunity. Go to the Germans and say, we both can't rely on the Americans. The Americans messed with you. They messed with us as well. The Americans told us that we can't buy American fighter jets because we bought some Russian S-400s. Isn't that some bullshit? Let's work together. Let's deepen our security ties against a common enemy. The common enemy is who? The Russians. That's what this is about at the end of the day. There are early signs of a deepening security conversation between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's team and its European counterparts. I wonder what's being said in those conversations. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan attended the emergency summit on Ukraine convened by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on March 2nd. So there you go. The British and the Turks working together. Isn't that interesting? There was a war between the Russians and the British in the 1850s, and the Turks were allied with the British against the Russians, and the Russians lost. Isn't that interesting that the British are so insanely anti-Russian? It's not crazy because you can see it in history. You can see it in history. Turkey has become a part of the coalition of the willing, headed by Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron. So you see the Europeans working with the Turks, and Turkey is a part of Europe. Don't forget that. Turkey is a European country. It's part of Europe, and it's a major European power, and it's only getting bigger. It's only growing. So what do the Turks see? The same opportunity that they saw in World War I. Make ties with the Germans against the Russians. This is why I say this whole channel is dedicated to what? Making history come alive. That's what this channel is about. After a summit on March 6th hosted by the EU, Erdogan signaled that Turkish troops could eventually be deployed in Ukraine. Ooh, I wonder why. Isn't it interesting? Is it not interesting the Turks played this same damn game with Syria? They said, oh, we have Kurdish terrorists in Syria, PKK, YPG. They're all in Syria, the evil Kurdish terrorists. We have to send troops into the Idlib province. And so the Turks sent in thousands of troops into the Idlib province under the guise of what? Under the guise of fighting ISIS, fighting Kurdish terrorists. And then we all knew, everybody who understood what was happening, everyone who was reading on the topic knew exactly why the Turks were there. The Russians knew, the Americans knew, they all knew. You can look at the WikiLeaks, you can read what was being said by people in that giant think tank Stratford, what they were saying. They were all saying this. You can go all the way back to 2015 and you can read about the Turkish aspirations of empire in Syria. It was very, very obvious. The whole purpose of going into Syria had nothing to do with terrorism. It had nothing to do with ISIS. It had nothing to do with fighting the Kurds. That was all what you would call a pretense. The sole reason why Turkey entered Syria was to overthrow Assad and take over the country. Even Erdogan himself said this back in 2012 or 2013. He said the whole purpose of us going into Syria is to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. This is what Erdogan said. The whole purpose of us getting involved in Syria is to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. That was the whole point. That was it. That was it. The revival of empire right there before our eyes. And we're seeing it. And as soon as Assad was overthrown, do you see Turkey fighting terrorists? They put the freaking terrorists in power. All of a sudden you started reading about Turkey's proxy, the HTS, Israel's proxy, America's proxy also. HTS murdering Alawites, murdering Christians, the Syrian rebels murdering people. It was like we were back in 2013, 2014 all over again with the mass murders that were happening. Turkey don't give a damn. Israel definitely doesn't give a shit. They love seeing Arabs killing each other. They say, oh, look, Arabs killing each other. You see, Arabs are animals. We told you so. And they want to keep the Arab world weak so they have opportunities to become more powerful. That's the whole purpose. And so that's what's been happening. That is what is going on. That's what's been going on. And so there you see Turkey controlling Syria. They have the same damn aspirations for Ukraine. We're going to go in there as a peacekeeping force. Oh, just like you went into the Idlib province to fight terrorism, to fight terrorists. You want to go there to be a peacekeeping force. And then what? What happens? This is just like what happened after World War I. You can look into this. It's insane. It's freaking insane. After World War I, do you know what the Japanese did to the Russians? This is crazy. Most people don't talk about this. The Russians were in the middle of a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the nationalists. So you had the Red Russians and you had the White Russians. The Red Russians were Bolsheviks. The White Russians were nationalists. They were anti-communist. After World War I, the Americans said, okay, let's help the nationalists defeat the communists. And the Americans were aiding the White Russians against the Red Russians. Japan deployed the largest body of soldiers than any other ally that entered Russia to help the White Russians. The Japanese put in, I think it was like 100,000 troops, parked them right into Russia to help the White Russians fight communism. Well, guess what happened? Eventually, the Americans withdrew out of Russia, and the Americans said, okay, everyone, let's withdraw out of Russia. It's all pointless. And the British said, yeah, it's all pointless. This whole war is bullshit. And the Japanese said, no, we are not going anywhere. Japan will stay in Russia. What was the whole point of that? The whole point of that was what? Japanese power. That's all it was. Japanese power. The Japanese wanted to flex their muscles, take territory, and they wanted to show the Russians who was boss. Anytime you get into these situations where some country is defeated, guess what happens? It's like a dead carcass. The vultures pop up out of the woodwork. Russia was in the middle of a civil war after World War I. There were the Japanese. Ukraine just got defeated. There's the Turks. Syria was going through a civil war. There's the Turks. There's the Israelis. There's the Americans. It's geopolitical vultures. Why didn't Russia help Assad? I suspect it's because the Russians and the Turks made a deal. And if I had to guess what that deal was, it was something that had to do with access into the Mediterranean. That's my suspicion, because Turkey controls access into the Mediterranean. This access is very, very important for the Russians. Very important for the Russians to have direct access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles. Turkey controls that access way. The reason why I say this is because before the outbreak of World War I, and this was one of the events that led up to World War I, the Russians... I have a cat that's playing with a random object on the floor. Playing with something there. The Russians were wanting to have direct access into the Mediterranean, and they also wanted free reign to travel through the Mediterranean. They wanted that freedom to travel within and through the Mediterranean without Turkey giving them a hard time. The Austrians, who were an ally of the Turks, the Austrians said, we want to annex Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Russians didn't want that, but the Turks, being an ally of the Austrians, went to the Russians and they said, Russia, if you allow the Austrians to annex Bosnia and Herzegovina, we will give you free access into the Mediterranean, and we will give you free travel through the Mediterranean without problems. And the Russians said, deal. And Bosnia and Herzegovina was annexed by the Austro-Hungarians, and Russia didn't do anything to stop them. This is one of the things that led up to World War I. So what happened in Bosnia? We all know what happened in Bosnia. Mr. Archduke Ferdinand was murdered by some guy named Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian nationalist. And the Austrians said, oh, Serbia, you're a terrorist, just killed one of our guys. This music is too loud. You're a terrorist, just killed one of our guys, and et cetera, et cetera. And then what happened? The Austrians invaded Serbia as a response to the assassination of the Archduke. I mean, they wanted to invade Serbia anyway, but they found their reason. And then what happened? The Austrians proceeded to butcher hundreds of thousands of Serbian civilians. And that happened because of what? Because the Russians made a deal with the Turks. The Russians wanted access and free travel through the Mediterranean. They got that access and they got that free travel from the Turks. And in exchange, the Russians did not stop the Austrians from annexing Bosnia and Herzegovina. That led to the assassination of the Archduke. That led to the invasion of Serbia by the Austrians. That led to the butchering of hundreds of thousands of Serbs. And eventually the Russians had to enter Serbia. The Russians entered Serbia to save their ally, the Serbs, from the Austrians. But this all... I don't want to say it was the sole reason that World War I happened, but one of the things that led up to World War I was the Russians making this deal. And so what do you see? You see Turkey having free reign over Syria. Russia didn't do anything. Russia never helped their ally Assad. Why? What was happening? I am assuming that a deal was made between the Turks and the Russians, and that it had something to do with direct access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. That is my opinion. That is my opinion. So it says here, Erdogan is nurturing ties with other key countries too. Polish Prime Minister. What the hell is Poland doing working with Turkey? Aren't the Poles supposedly super proud people? Aren't they supposed to be like super proud that the Poles, the winged hussars, defeated the Ottoman Empire and saved Austria? Isn't that what these Polish people are always talking about all the time? Like, oh, we saved Austria, we saved Europe. What the hell is Poland doing working with Turkey? Erdogan is nurturing ties with the other key countries too. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk was in Ankara on March 12th to discuss Ukraine and European security. To be sure, it is still early and the shape and mission of a European-led force remains shrouded in uncertainty. Much hinges on Trump's ongoing effort to convince Putin to agree to a ceasefire. However, if some sort of deal is cut, Turkey could play a major part in making it stick. Having extended steadfast support to Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, but also having kept ties to Russia and even having led mediation efforts, Turkey's military presence would likely be acceptable to both parties. Now, I think this is sort of a stretch. I honestly, this is me being just me being transparent here. I honestly believe that let me rephrase. I honestly would be very shocked if Turkey was allowed to deploy troops into Ukraine. I would be shocked because I just don't see the Russians accepting that. But again, as I like to say, the future will always shock us. And when we make these sorts of predictions, we're going to make mistakes, and the future will ambush us with the reality, with truth. And so if Turkey is allowed, if Turkey has the opportunity, Turkey will take the opportunity to deploy troops into Ukraine. And if that happens, I mean, if Turkey, listen, I'll put it to you this way. Russia has made it very clear. No NATO troops in Ukraine. No NATO troops in Ukraine. We don't give a damn if they're going to be there under a different flag. We don't give a damn if they're not going to be there under the NATO flag. We don't give a damn if they're just going to be there as observers. No NATO troops in Ukraine. Russia has made this overwhelmingly clear. And the Russians have made it clear that if NATO troops go into Ukraine, even as peacekeepers, that the Russians will see it as a declaration of war. So are the Americans going to say to the Europeans and to the Turks, go ahead, go forth, put your soldiers in Ukraine? Do the Americans want to risk the Russians doing a military retaliation? Are they willing to make that risk? So it's possible that the Americans will tell the Europeans to back off because they don't want to deal with Russian retaliation. And that later on in the future, the Europeans are going to say, we're going to do it. We don't give a shit. Boom. And then you could have an outbreak of a Russo-Turco-European war. I can totally see this happening. Totally see it happening. Having extended steadfast support to Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, but also having kept ties to Russia and even having led the mediation efforts, Turkey's military presence, blah, 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 blah. While Moscow has lashed out at the idea of European peacekeepers, but it has been silent on Turkey. Can Turkey perform the job of peacekeeper? There is reason to think so. The past decade has seen Ankara send troops to various other countries, such as Syria, Libya, and Azerbaijan. In the first two cases, it has even come to blows with Russia, and this is true. In Syria, in February, I want to say, of 2020, the Russians and the Syrians butchered literally dozens of Turkish soldiers. Dozens were killed by the Russians and the Syrians, and the Turks did no retaliation. There was no war. There wasn't any outbreak of war between the Russians and the Turks. Why? Because I don't think the Russians are interested right now in a war with Turkey. Right now, I don't think they're interested in a war with Turkey because right now the Russians are dealing with Ukraine. So the Russians are trying to maintain this sense of diplomacy with the Turks and all that. Now, this article says that it's possible that Russia could even allow the Turks to be in Ukraine. I have my doubts about that. The Russians know their history. The Russians don't, I don't think the Russians fully trust the Turks. Obviously not. I mean, given the history, they're definitely rivals over the Black Sea. They're rivals, they're Black Sea rivals. They have a long history of bloodshed. I just don't see the Russians saying, oh yeah, Turks can go ahead and put their troops in Ukraine. I don't see that happening. If it does happen, I'll be very surprised. What I can see happening is there being a duration of silence, and then all of a sudden, boom, the Europeans and the Turks decide just to go forth and do it, and a war breaks out. Or I can see Russia doing something and the Europeans using that as a pretext to start a war. I can see all these. I can see this is going to happen. It's all going to flesh itself out. How it's going to happen, we don't know 100%, but they are plausible predictions. So it says here, in Syria, Turkish forces ended up running joint patrols with the Russian military, but again, that's in Syria. Syria is within Turkey's sphere of influence, so Russia is going to have more of a respect for Turkey in Syria. But when it comes to Ukraine, which is Russia's sphere of influence, I don't see the Russians just saying, "Oh yeah, Turkey, go ahead, come on in." Turkish forces, blah, 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 in order to police a fragile peace around Idlib. In other words, Turkey has accumulated significant experience in managing conflicts with Russia. Erdogan and Putin, along with their top brass, have exchanged punches, but have also sat at the negotiation table to craft solutions. Turkey now hopes that security cooperation with Europe and Ukraine could spill into the EU-Turkey relationship. This could involve a wider security partnership based on containing Russia and underwriting stability in Europe, but Turks are also keen to negotiate an update of their 1995 customs union. So the Turks are still interested in becoming an EU member. That could actually happen. I remember after Brexit happened, there were some talks about how, well, now that the British are no longer in the EU, they've sort of left a vacuum that Turkey could fill up. So I could see Turkey becoming an EU country. Even if they don't become an EU country, there is still going to be a Turco-Germanic alliance. That's still going on. They're already allies, but I see the Germans and the Turks deepening that alliance at a military level. So it says here that this could involve a wider security partnership based on containing Russia. This is accurate. I believe this is 100% accurate. I can totally see the Germans and the Turks getting together to contain Russia. And this is the whole agenda of the United States. Go back to Gladio. Go back to the Cold War. Go back to the Cold War. What was the Gladio operation all about? It was about using the Turks and the Europeans to go against the Russians, the Soviets. The game plan hasn't changed. Go back to World War I, Turkey and Germany. Go back to World War II, Germany. It was Germany alongside its European allies. So the Americans are following the same book. They're following the same plan. Use the Turks and the Germans against the Russians. There's a reason why Churchill was giddy and excited about the rise of fascism, because he believed that the fascists could be used as a proxy against the Bolsheviks. And there's a reason why we see Donald Trump and we see J.D. Vance and we see Elon Musk supporting the revival of militarism in Germany. There's a reason why J.D. Vance and Elon Musk support the AfD, because they want the fascists to rise, because they believe, just as Churchill at one point did, that the fascists could be used as a weapon against the Russians. Like Europe's other trading partners, Turkey has been adapting to the European Commission. I don't really give a shit about this. I don't even know why I highlighted it. While Europe is gearing to ramp up military spending, Turkish companies such as Aselsan or Baykar, which manufactures the Bayraktar drone, would like to profit. Of course they would. Baykar and Leonardo, a leading Italian firm, recently set up a joint venture focused on artificial intelligence and unmanned platforms. Yet, realistically, the EU has long lost its leverage over domestic politics in Turkey. A return to full-fledged democracy depends on citizens and elites, not conditionality. But amid the doom and gloom, there are some glimmers of hope. And here's the bullshit. Erdogan's loss in Turkey's 2024 local elections in Istanbul, and more recently, the prospective end to the conflict in the country's Kurdish-populated southeastern provinces. So they're saying, oh, look, the secular nationalists defeated Erdogan's party in regional or local elections. They're specifically talking about Istanbul. In Istanbul, Erdogan's AK party lost the election to who? CHP, the Turkish People's Republican Party, which is an ultranationalist secularist party. They are a direct successor to the Young Turks who orchestrated the Armenian genocide. And the bullshit Western media wants you to get optimistic and enthusiastic and excited about the rise of Turkish secular nationalism. This is why I did a video recently entitled "Secular Turkish Nationalism is Evil." Because too many people are being fooled by this stuff. They're saying, oh, this is great, wonderful. Really, go back to the Turkish nationalists of World War I, the Young Turks, the Ittihad government, the CUP, the Party of Union and Progress. Go read about what those people did to the Christians, to the Armenians, to the Assyrians, to the Greeks. They butchered these people, and they were secularists, and they worked with the Islamists to butcher the Christians. And you have these assholes saying, oh, it's so wonderful. This is what I hate about NATO media. NATO media always wants you to ignore historical realities. Unless of course, those historical realities are advantageous for them. If those historical realities are advantageous for them, they will bring it up. They want you to know that history very, very well. If it is advantageous for them to talk about what atrocities Stalin did, they will bring that up because they want you to hate the Russians. But if the CHP is rising, and the fact is that the CHP is a direct successor to the Young Turks who orchestrated the Armenian genocide, they don't want you to focus on that history. They want you to think, oh, democracy, oh, secular government, oh, Erdogan is the Islamist neo-sultanate, he's the evil tyrant, but these secular guys, they're the good guys, so you should support them. It's like the whole woke thing. Oh, wokeism is bad. Wokeism is the big bad boogeyman. Oh, so who should we follow then? What should we do? You should follow Elon Musk, even though he's a eugenist. You should follow Peter Thiel, even though he's a eugenist. You see, that's how this evil works. They point to one evil so they can convince you to follow another evil. That's how this whole thing works.